have a long list of names as we take a look at the genealogy of Jesus. And Matthew begins his gospel not with the birth story, but with the ancestor story. This is where this guy comes from. This is where Joseph comes from. So Luke has just one line, because he was of the house and the lineage of David. Matthew has the whole story all the way back to Abraham. So Jesus is born.
What's the Old Testament thing where they do all the lineage?
Oh, all the begats. Genesis has long lists of begats. The Kings, the book of Kings, 1st and 2nd Samuel, have stories of ancestry and who is the son of whom and where you came from. That's really important. And the Matthew's gospel says, yes, Jesus is born in Bethlehem. And he is the child of, thought to be the child of Joseph and Mary, but of Mary and the Heavenly Father through the Spirit. And that, nevertheless, there is a lineage and a history that brings his birth about, a connectedness. So part of the story that Matthew is telling is that Jesus is a child of the covenant. God promised him. God promised a covenant with God's children that would not be broken. It is a covenant of lordship and relationship with God, a covenant of kingship and relationship with God. It is through Abraham. It is through David. Jesus is of the tribe of Judah. That's his lineage. And so that's all good. And we celebrate that because those are the big names in Hebrew tradition. Abraham and David, the tribe of Judah, the Lion of Judah, Jesus. Okay.
I'll bet these kids were glad that they didn't have to write all that down.
Well, I'm sure they all knew this. I'm sure they would.
Known it, but I bet, when a kid goes to kindergarten or first grade, they have to know how to spell a name.
Exactly.
Oh my God.
I bet every little Jewish kid knew his family story for 15 generations.
Oh, yeah.
And could write it down. I know where I come from. Now, when we start out with Abraham, the father of Isaac, Isaac, the father of Jacob, Jacob, the father of Judah and his brothers. And one of Judah's brothers was named what? Joseph, who is thrown into a pit. And who threw Joseph into a pit? His brothers. Okay, Judah, there's trouble already. And we've only gone. Yeah, exactly. He comes off as being a little better than his brothers, and you think, oh my goodness, there's trouble. There is human frailty in the story. And then we think back, well, actually, Jacob. What did Jacob do? Stole his brother's blessing and birthright. So that is the human story. There is dynamics in families. Families have dynamics. It is not always smooth sailing all the time, but out of family dynamics, God's purpose unfolds. And so we have a little sense of family dynamics. And Judah has family dynamics that show up at the end of the first line of verse 3. Judah was the father of whom and whom, whose mother was whom? Judah was the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. So now, do we know the story of Tamar? Actually, she was I don't even know what the family connection. She married. Yes, actually, she married Judah's son.
Would just Perez have a mother?
Yes.
Perez.
Tamar,
Everybody's got a mother.
yeah,
It's not specific of that. It said Sarah, whose mother was Tamar,
Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. So both. So we have in Genesis, we're not going to go to it, I'll just give you the rough outline. Genesis 38, the story of Tamar. Tamar is the daughter-in-law of Judah. Tamar married Judah's son. Judah's son died. Tamar didn't have any kids. And so in Jewish tradition, if you didn't have kids and your husband died, what do? Oh, you marry the brother. So Tamar married Judah's other son. And the other son died, he felt a little uneasy about the whole Tamar having married his brother, and his brother died. And so he marries Tamar, is a little squeamish, he dies. So then Tamar marries a third son who doesn't want anything to do with her, and there will be no children. So Tamar is going to be out of the family. And when you're out of the family, and you're a woman, you don't have any prospects. You don't have a life. You don't belong. So Tamar is kicked to the curb. But Tamar is a very wise woman. And Tamar figures out that I have been treated shamefully and horribly by Judah, and I know what kind of guy he is. So Tamar dresses up as a prostitute, waits by the gate. Judah comes into town, doesn't recognize her, thinks, oh, you're a pretty good-looking woman. One thing leads to another. Judah spends the evening with Tamar and wants to give her a token of his affection, and he gives her a ring, and time goes on. Tamar is pregnant. She shows up at Judah's house and says, someone in the family is the father of my child. Judah is all shook up. And what do you mean someone is the family? And Tamar says, and I have a way to show you who it is. And she pulls out the ring, and it's Judah. So Tamar marries her father-in-law and has a couple of kids. I mean, it is convoluted and very unusual, but it's in the story. I mean, you think about keeping the skeletons in the closet. Matthew pulls the skeletons out of the closet and says, have I got some skeletons for you? And begins telling the story. And we aren't 3 verses in before we start with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's good. We all know them. I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Hello, Barbara. Come on down. And we have right in verse 3, Tamar, and her story is a part of Jesus being born in Bethlehem. And then we skip down. We have some family history. Nahshon, the father of Salmon the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. Okay, how do we feel about that? What do we know about Rahab? She was a prostitute, and where did she live? Jericho. She was not a Jew. Rahab was from Jericho before the Jews got there. So Rahab is not a Jew, and she's a prostitute. And it's interesting that Matthew tells the story of Jesus' birth into the world by tracing his Jewish ancestry, but including things that you typically wouldn't include. Women, typically not included. People of questionable reputation, not included. Skeletons in the closet, not brought out into the open. And Matthew does all that right at the very beginning, because it is into a broken humanity that Jesus is born. And the story of the generations that lead to the birth of Jesus in Bethlehem is the human story. Everyone comes from somewhere, and everyone has stories in their family history. And, we own them if we are faithful. And that's what Matthew does in telling the story. Now, what's interesting is in the Bethlehem story in Luke, Joseph goes to Bethlehem, they don't let him in. No skeletons in our closets. No rough edges in our family histories. We've got it all nice and tidy, and we don't want the pregnant teenage girl who isn't married coming in and messing things up. And Matthew starts out at the very beginning saying, look, people, this is the truth of who we are. And God works with it. God works through it. So Rahab is a prostitute in Jericho. The Jews have come to Jericho. There's a standoff. Jericho won't let them through. So there's a battle. And before the battle, the Jewish leader sends spies into Jericho. Rahab provides shelter for the spies, hides them, and lowers them down out of the window in the wall through a rope so they can go back and tell the Israelite commanders what is awaiting them in Jericho. And so Rahab marries Salmon, who's a Jewish guy, after the fall of Jericho, and gives birth to a person named who? Boaz. Boaz is very important. Now, we don't know that Boaz is very important when his mother, the former harlot in Jericho, marries Salmon, and they have a baby and name him Boaz. But Boaz becomes the kinsman that Naomi and Ruth go to because there's famine in the land where they are. And so they're starving. Ruth's and Naomi's husbands die. And
so they go out in the field and gather.
They go back to Judea and connect with Naomi's family. And Ruth is a Moabitess. She's not Jewish either. And she meets the son of a guy whose mother wasn't Jewish. Or she meets the son who is the guy whose mother wasn't Jewish. So Boaz is the son of Rahab. And Boaz meets Ruth, and they fall in love, and there's the whole threshing floor scene, which is John the Baptist shows up and says that the Son of God is going to come and cleanse the threshing floor. And there's a couple of threshing floor stories you have to know to understand what that means. And part of it is Ruth and Boaz fall in love and have a baby, and it's Obed who becomes the father of Jesse, who becomes the father of David. So it's through Boaz that King David is born, and Boaz and Ruth fall in love after the gleaning of the fields, and they're in the threshing floor, and Ruth is asleep in the cold, and Boaz covers her up, and they live happily ever after, right? That's a threshing floor story. The temple in Jerusalem was built on a threshing floor, on a granary. It used to be a granary. It became the temple in Jerusalem. Solomon built it. So the threshing floor can be the place where we meet and find love, or it can be the place that becomes corruption and compromise with the oppressive powers that are trying to control our lives. What happens on the threshing floor is up to us. And Jesus has come to clean out the crap and to restore the granary and to bring the blessing of love back into our lives. That's what John the Baptist is saying. And John the Baptist gets pretty heated about it and says, all that crap that has made its way into the place where we are supposed to find love, which is the earth, God is going to cleanse that, get all that crap out of the way.
Is that the way they talk to these groups that follow pastors? They talk about crap.
They do. Yeah, they do. Not as much as I do.
Okay.
But yeah, it's a biblical word, Greek, skubala, the offscouring. Paul says, I count everything else as skubala. And actually, it's as though torn from today's headlines. Did you see archaeologists unearthed toilets in Jerusalem? And now they're figuring out that people who lived in Jerusalem from 1 BC to 1 AD had intestinal parasites. Go figure. It's as though torn from today's headlines, Glenn.
Just
Good
enough for me.
So, but John the Baptist says God is going to, or the Son of God is going to cleanse the granary of all the impediments, so nothing stands in the way of our falling in love with God. That's what he's saying. And so Ruth is a part of the story. Ruth marries Boaz. Boaz and Ruth have a son, Obed. He has a son, Jesse, and he has a son, David. And so now we're on a roll. Now things are going to be cleaned up. David is a child after God's own heart. God loves David. David loves God. David is the shepherd boy who defeats Goliath in the name of the Lord and becomes king over Israel. And so now we have the path of the kings, and things are going to fall into place, right? Wrong. Not going to fall into place, because verse 6 says David was the father of who? Solomon. Hooray, Solomon. Solomon's great. We love Solomon. And who was Solomon's mother? Uriah's wife, Bathsheba. And how did David and Bathsheba get together?
David.
Yeah, David seduced her, brought her to the palace. That's right, the palace. Slept with her. She was someone else's wife. David comes up with this great idea. I'm going to send her husband into the front lines of the battle. When he's there, have the general pull everyone else back, and Uriah will be killed. And that's what David does. So David and Bathsheba are together, but at great cost. The first child she has dies. David prays and prays for this child that's been born, that it will live, and the child dies. And everyone expects that David will go into mourning, and David comes out all showered and shaved and perfumed. And the people say, what's the deal? You should be in mourning. And David says, I mourned and wept and prayed when there was hope that he will live, but he won't come back to me. One day I'll go to him. So that, I know that the relationship is still intact, and one day I'll go to him. But it is as God has decreed. And so David goes forward with his life, and he and Bathsheba have another son, and that son is Solomon. And Solomon becomes king over Israel and builds the temple in Jerusalem, and Solomon does great things and has great wisdom. And then we have a list of names that take us down to verse 12, or verse 11, really. Josiah, the father of Jeconiah, and his brothers at the time of the exile to Babylon. That is, I think that Manasseh, Hezekiah, and Josiah. Josiah is the king who does the reforms when they find the book of Deuteronomy in the basement of the temple, and Josiah tries to clean things up. Yeah, exactly. But it's too late, and the Babylonians come in and destroy the temple, take the king into exile, and send the people of Jerusalem into exile in Babylon. And that is a moment when all is lost. Enslaved, as sent to Babylon as slaves. So you think that that's the end of the story. It's the end of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. It's the end of the temple, and it's the end of the king. But is that the end? No. This is why the wise men are so important. The wise men are a part of this exile to Babylon story. That's where the wise men show up in history. They're part of a culture that's adjacent to Babylon, and when the Persians come 50 years after the exile to Babylon and defeat the Babylonians, they draw the Medes, the Magi, into their orbit, into their culture. They take them too. And the Magi become leaders and priests and astrologers in the Persian court. So they're absorbed into the Persian culture, and they have a place in the Persian court. And they have that place for 50 years while Cyrus is ruler of Persia. Cyrus defeats the Babylonians, sends the Israelites back to Judea, back to Jerusalem, gives them money to rebuild their temple and rebuild their lives.
Why is that?
Exactly. Why is that? Isaiah said it is because God used him as God's instrument. That in some way God had to bring the nation home, and that's how God did it. Now, did Cyrus know that he was an instrument in the hands of the living God? We don't know, but we do know that there are elements of Persian culture and theology that came into the Jewish tradition at the time of Cyrus. So, like the word paradise is a Persian word that came into the uh, lexicon of Jewish theology to describe the divine life, paradise, because that's how the Persians described it. The Persians had a creator God, and so when the Jews talked about the one living and true God, the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, the Persians could kind of get that. And so there were points of contact. The Persians had angels in their tradition, and the Jews had angels as spiritual beings, and they could have points of contact and common ground around that. So there were things that theologically were common ground. And so the Jews were sent back to Israel to rebuild the temple, rebuild their lives. Cyrus the Persian gave them the freedom to do that. And Persia, Judea, Egypt kind of for 50 years lived together. Then Cyrus died, and the next guy was only leader of Persia for a couple of years, and then he died. And then a guy named Darius the First came to the throne in Persia, and he looked at the Magi as a group and said, "You guys are becoming too powerful and have too much influence in the court of the Persians, and you're not even Persian. It was only a couple generations ago you lived up north of the Babylonian border. And so we kind of took you in and drew you in, but you have your own culture and your own history. And since you have such influence and power in the court in Persia, we're going to get rid of you. And we're not just going to send you packing, we're going to kill you." And so Darius the First sets out to kill the Magi, the Mede population in Persia. And so they run.
Smart guy.
Yeah, and they run. And historically, the ones who survive are the ones who run as far as India. So you think about how far the Persians chased these people to get rid of them. And, after they crossed the Indus River, the Persians thought, okay, that's far enough. You won't trouble us anymore. 500 years go by, and the Magi show up in Jerusalem saying, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews?" I mean, you think about that. That's an amazing dynamic in history. And so the
Well, that's where they came from.
the Jews and the Magi are woven into the fabric of history together with the deportation to Babylon. That's when it all begins in that relationship. And it goes 500 years. Oh, yeah, David is 1000 BC. Is like 550. So yeah, the return from Babylon is about 550, and the persecution of the Magi is 500. So it's about 50 years after that. So, but the um, being sent into Babylon is a huge part of Jesus' story because it is people who are in captivity who are brought home. And Jesus is born as the one who comes into the world to bring people who are in captivity home to God. Now, we're not in captivity to the Babylonians. What are we in captivity to? You will call his name Jesus because he will free his people from their sins. We are in captivity to sin and death. And Jesus has come into the world to lead God's children to freedom from the power and captivity to sin and death. And so we get these generations that Jesus is born in Bethlehem in the days of Herod the king, but he came from somewhere. And it is not a nice, shiny, polished history. It is a human history. And we all come from somewhere. And we all have a history. And we probably don't know our family history as well as uh, the Jews embrace and maintain and know their own personal family histories, but we have it. And it informs who we are. And there's a culture that we're born into. And some of us were born into different cultures and different traditions. So if I were to say me, what culture was I born into? My dad's mother was Jewish, so I'm a quarter Jewish. Could have been a rabbi, but went the whole Christian route. But he was not raised by his parents. He was left at the doorstep of a family in Newark, New Jersey, when he was 2 years old, and they took him in. His dad was Jewish, his mother was Jewish, his dad was Irish. They were together for 2 years after he was born, but because of the cultural pressures at the time, a Jewish girl and an Irish guy couldn't live together without the community deciding that this was going to bring shame on both their houses. And so they split, and she left. It wasn't until about 5 years ago that I ever saw a picture of her. One of my sisters is into family histories and unearthed a picture of my father's mother, um, which was very odd. And his dad stayed in the Newark area and was a high school principal and a teacher. So, from his father. So the Brady came from my dad's birth father. The family that raised him was named Krause. And they raised him in New Jersey, and he left to join the Navy. Went in the Navy, got home from the Navy, um, went to school, got his degree, studied for the ministry, and went up to Alaska as a missionary. So after the war, like 1947, 48, he went up to Alaska as a missionary in the mission field working with the Eskimos. In Alaska, he meets this gal who's working in the mission field as a nurse with the Eskimos. She's from Pennsylvania, went to nursing school in Philadelphia, my mom. So they meet in the mission field in Alaska. And my mom's line was always, I had to go to Alaska to meet a guy from New Jersey. That's that was her story. And so they met. I was born in Alaska, in the mission field in an Eskimo village. I was born in a hospital in Bethel, a military hospital, and then was flown by bush pilot to the Eskimo village. And the family story. Every family has a birth story, right? About how you're born. So I'm the last of 6 kids. So my mom had been through this before. If you were a spring through fall kid, you were born in Alaska. If you were a winter kid, you were born in New Jersey because she would fly back to be with family if she was going to have a baby in the winter, because having a baby in the winter in Alaska in an Eskimo village It's a roll of the dice. So half of my siblings are New Jersey, half of them are Alaska. So I was born in Alaska. The bush pilot lands the plane. My dad runs out to the plane. This is how my sister tells it. Aunt Maureen, if you were here, you would tell it better. And Dad runs out to the plane shouting, "My son, my son." And he takes the baby from my mom, takes the baby from its mother's arms, holds it in his arms, and runs back in the house. And all I can remember is watching Mom and the pilot carry the luggage down into the house. That was the story, is Dad ran into the house carrying the baby. My mom and the pilot carried the luggage. That's the biblical birth story. So that's kind of the history. And everyone has a story and everyone comes from somewhere. Um, and I knew my mom's family very well. I used to go back and spend summers with my grandmother, my mom's mom, and her family in Pennsylvania. Had no idea about anything about my dad until I went to divinity school in New Jersey. And it was my second year in seminary in New Jersey. And I thought, that family where he grew up is just up the road. And I knew their name. And I called the church and said, this is someone I'm looking for. They live in this town. Oh, yeah, they're still there. I think this is where they live. So I drove up and I knocked on the door. And people came to the door. And I said, this is who I am. Oh, my goodness. And we had a big party. I stayed late in the night, had a barbecue, called friends, told stories, got out photo albums. It was just an amazing thing. So, everybody comes from somewhere. So I was born in Alaska. Where were you born? San Jose. And your family lived in Cupertino. So you're from here. And I bet you have a birth story that at least the family shares and everyone has one. And so San Jose and Cupertino were the family connection. And Teresa, where were you born? San Francisco. And is your family San Francisco family? I've been to visit Teresa's family in the cemetery, the family that has passed on to be with God in glory. And we went, and Teresa's pointing out the people in the cemetery. Oh, that's Uncle Jack, and that's, Aunt so-and-so, and I used to go to their house and do, that's part of why we have those gravestones in the cemetery, so you can go back. Literally, the tomb in the Greek is the place of memory. And you go back to remember. That's why you go and remember the connections, to remember where you came from. So San Francisco, born in San Francisco, raised in San Francisco family, met your husband in San Francisco. That's right. And Lori, where were you born? Oh, the old Stanford Hospital. And you grew up right back here. Oh, okay. Yeah, that is consistent with the stories I've heard about your dad. Yeah. So born in the old Stanford Hospital, raised in Cupertino, and the floor in this building is the same floor that's here when you were a kid in this church. And Barbara, where were you born? Wow. Born in the hospital in Carmel, right next to Clint Eastwood. Yeah, there you go. And then grew up in Saratoga and Cupertino. No. Yeah. And actually, Saratoga does have tracks that goes through it. Yes. And it's, yes. And there was a right side of the tracks and a wrong side of the tracks. And then moved to Cupertino when you were 9. 8. And Cecilia, where were you born? In China. And so where in China? So in the Sichuan region of China, and you came to the United States in college? Okay. Okay. And that was after the war. Oh, so 1959, your parents came from China. And so you still have family back in China? No family? Okay. Okay. And, and then you met Chung in Washington State? So you met Chung in school in Seattle, Washington, and then moved here and had your family and your children here. And Jen, where were you born? Yeah. Really? See? So Lori's parents met at the University of Washington in Seattle, and your parents, and you met Chung at the University of Washington. Very cool. And Jen, where were you born? Oh, same province in Sichuan. Wow. Wow. So that is really miraculous. In it really, and Cecilia, I think you barely survived being born. Wow, what a miracle. That's a miracle and a miracle. See, this God's plan and purpose unfolds when you think all is lost. All isn't lost, and the miracle happens. Susan, where were you born? Okay. 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 And now, are they dispersed or are they? Yeah. Okay. Okay. And so you grew up in Sunnyvale, live in Sunnyvale, and have kids and grandkids in a variety of places. And your lovely mother is sitting right next to you. You were great with child once upon a time, and here she is, twice upon a time. And where were you born, Lee? Glendale, California. Is that down by L.A.? Okay, so were you a Ralph when you were born? Okay. Yep. Wow. And so the Ralph name. Wow. Same. Wow. It's beautiful. There's no place like home. And Sally, you were born in Colorado.
Yes, I was.
Yeah.
My mother delivered me.
Herself.
Yeah. I was born in February, and we were out on the ranch, and Dad called. He went into town for something, and he called and said, "How are things?" Because he knew that he was about to deliver. And my grandfather didn't know that she was upstairs having pains, and so he said, "Everything's fine." So Dad didn't bring the doctor with him like he was supposed to. So Mom yelled down to Poppy and said, "Come up here and help me with this baby." She had read everything in the world about what to do, and I was the fifth one to be born.
And so your first smack on the butt was your mom when you were born.
Yeah, or grandfather.
Okay.
I was born to preach, and so.
Oh my goodness.
And so she had learned about all of that, and so that's one of the Allen stories.
Ah, yes. See, so the birth stories.
Yeah.
The stories to tell, and families have them. And Glenn, where were you born?
Corpus Christi, Texas, Body of Christ, Texas.
Really?
My dad was in the Navy and had gone to San Francisco to a party with a gal and met my mom there. And then my mom had supposedly had an incident falling off a cable car or something, living at home. And so said to my dad, said to my grandfather, "Hey, can I take this gal off your problem list?" And he said, "Go ahead."
So your folks got married up here.
Yeah.
And then the Navy brought them down to Texas.
They got married at Stanford Chapel.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
And then they started in Texas, they went to helicopter training in Pennsylvania, Florida. We had a tour in Virginia, went up to Yale where my sister was born, but somewhere along the line they adopted my brother. My mom and my sister had this battle of who's going to have the kid, and my mom was losing since she adopted my brother. And so, when everybody has a story, well, he was they were bringing out these babies at the orphanage, and my mom and I go, no. There's this really smiley kid, seemed to have optimism and happy guy. He's the one who takes him home. So,
Ah.
story. Then my sister came along, and then we finally, on all these tours in the Navy, we got back to California, and been here ever since.
So as a kid, though, you were a Navy kid moving.
All the time. 2 years here, 3 years there, 2 years here, 3 years there.
And now planted in California.
Yeah, well, we were originally Glendennings, and the Glendennings stone is.
Oh, that's right. Glendenning is from here. Yeah.
Low 1800s, and that stuff. My mom is also now buried in Mission City. So.
Yep. Amen. So, how many are youngest children? in the family? Youngest. The youngest. Okay, how many are oldest children in their family? Are you the only? Only? How many onlys? Teresa's an only? Are you an only? Okay. So we have any middles? Oh, Cecilia's a middle. So we have several oldest, several youngest. Let's see those youngest again. Okay, now we know who's spoiled. That's good. We're in this together. Yeah, youngest. So, this Jesus being born and the family history and the story, and we all have the cultural history, ancestral history, and the dynamics. I mean, there's a book called From Generation to Generation, written by a psychologist named Friedman, who everybody who goes to seminary has to read because family dynamics are passed down from generation to generation. And we keep living the same traumas until we stop living them. But if we stay on default and automatic pilot, we keep living the same traumas and the same dynamics. So Jesus is born and things change. That's right. History changes. That as human beings, we can choose to be part of the solution and change history. That's what Matthew tells us in the story of Jesus. We're not perfect, but we can be part of the solution. We can enter into the unfolding plan of God and know that we're part of a higher purpose and a higher calling and live that out, which people did. And look what happened. The other thing, we have two more things to touch on. What do we got? Okay, good. It's 6 minutes. Two more things. One is you hear a lot of people talking about, I won the birth lottery because I was born in America. Have you heard people say that? On the news, people say it quite a lot. I won the birth lottery, and everyone who's born has won the birth lottery. Being born into the world is a gift. And part of what Matthew is saying is that there were so many things that had to happen just the way they happened in the craziness of the world for us to be here. Every human life is a miraculous gift brought about through the twists and turns and ups and downs of human history. And there were times when we almost weren't here, but here we are. And that is a miracle.
Where would your spirit be if you weren't born?
Bring it up with the guy who knows the answer to that. I don't know, but here we are. The miraculous nature of us being here is something we don't often recognize, and the value, the sacredness of each human life is a part of this story. That each relationship, each begetting, each child born to a parents is, while it might be convoluted, like David and Bathsheba or Judah and Tamar, is sacred. That there is a sanctity to each human life. And God's plan for human life unfolds in the life of each child of God.
And there's more than we can see in these most stories, but we're not beholden in our homes to gun violence. We're not hopefully having opioids and people dying of overdoses when they did. These are real tragedies going on in our outlying communities now that we don't have here. I'm not trying to say comment about that. There's a lot of bad stuff.
There are bad things that happen in the world, and sometimes we feel protected from them. But human life is fragile and sacred, and there is tragedy in people's lives that we don't know or see when they close their front door. The other thing is that Jesus makes a point to his disciples, and you think about it. I thought about this reading about them unearthing the homes of the rich and famous in Jerusalem and finding the restrooms. And, who would have wanted to have been alive in the first century in Jerusalem? Pretty rugged time. And yet Jesus says to his disciples, kings and prophets longed to see the things that you see and didn't see them, and hear the things that you hear and didn't hear them. And so the miraculous moment is being alive in the presence of the reality of God. And that is a moment that's possible for every child of God born into the world. And so, we have this unique sacred opportunity being alive in the creation of God. So that was one of the things to touch on. And the second thing,
In our church too, we have an obligation to look after the people who are aged, who don't have a lot of things going on, and they may say, "Hey, I'm kind of done with this life. I don't have a purpose." But there's a real purpose in an outreach like your own in the church, where we can pull these people along and say, "You don't understand really how valuable you are."
that's really true. Glenn makes an important point that it's the life of the church which helps share the truth of how sacred and valuable and important each life is. And as we do that in our connection with one another in the church, we are living out this sanctity of every child of God is a child of sacred worth, and honoring that and celebrating it. So in Matthew, verse 18, where did we end? I guess Barbara. Yes. Yes, that's a question we don't know the answer to. We just know that they did. But we know that he was born before they were married, and then we know that they did get married, but we don't know. And so and that's part of what Matthew talks about in this section 18 to 24. So if we just take a look at that, we will be ready to celebrate Jesus' birth and his ancestry and his community. And so, Barbara, if you would read 18 and 19, and Cecilia 20 and 21, and Jan 22 and 23, and Susan 24 and 25, that will take us to the end of Jesus' birth story.
Now the birth of Jesus the Messiah took place in this way. When his mother Mary had been engaged to Joseph, but before they lived together, he was child from the Holy Spirit. Her husband Joseph, being a righteous man, and unwilling to expose her to public disgrace, planned to deceive her twice. But after he had considered this, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream and said, Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary home as your wife, because what is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will give birth to a son, and you are to give him the name Jesus, because he will save his people from their sins. All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had said through the prophet. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and we will call him Emmanuel, which means God with us.
Well, they were together at home, but unmarried. Yeah. And so the marriage and consummation of the marriage take place sometime after Jesus' birth. But the issue, and this is interesting, the Joseph did not want to expose Mary to public disgrace. Yeah, that there, the consequences for that, and why in Luke's story they don't go visit the relatives in Bethlehem, is because of the public disgrace associated with her and Joseph in the time of Jesus' birth. And so you think of the stresses on the family when Jesus is born, and they hold together. The family holds together. Joseph and Mary hold together when the cultural pressures were tremendous. And they give birth to this boy and name him Jesus because that's what, in a dream, Joseph was instructed to do. So Joseph remains faithful in a time of tremendous cultural pressure. He remains faithful to God and to Mary and to the baby. And that's the family Jesus is born into. Barbara. Yeah, her kinswoman Elizabeth. Yeah. Certainly didn't send out the welcome mat the way Elizabeth did. And you think about, what the risk was to Elizabeth to let her into the house. And she opened the door and brought her in and celebrated her and sang with her, and Mary was at home. And part of the reason Mary left to go to Elizabeth must have been because of the cultural pressure brought to bear on her own household, as she was great with child. There are traditions of Mary's mother and the restoration of the relationship, but it's, Mary and Joseph and the promise of God. And they go through that, but it is a long line that brings them to that place. And it is, parents, God bless them, through force of will and determination and whatever it is, here we are. And yes, actually, Mary had good sense in choosing a partner. Yes.
It's true.
That they were confirmed in the faith that God was with them, and it was going to be a bumpy road, but that they weren't alone on that road. God was with them. And so Jesus is born into this world with parents and grandparents and a culture and traditions and ancestry that comes with him. And it's a blessing, but it's also baggage. And we all have that. We all have the blessing and the baggage. And in Luke, Matthew's gospel begins with Abraham. Where does Luke's gospel take us? What's the last? It ends with who? Adam. Luke goes back beyond Abraham and says Jesus isn't just son of the covenant. Jesus is the one who came to bring the covenant to all the descendants of Adam. And who would that be? Everybody. This is an everybody blessing. Everybody is caught up in this. Matthew's gospel begins with the story of the ancestors. When does Luke put in the story of the ancestors? After the baptism. The crowds are there at the baptism. Jesus goes into the water. He's baptized with the crowds One at a time, they're going in. John the Baptist is at the Jordan River, and he's saying, next, next, next. And people are going in, and Jesus is just one of the crowd, except he's Jesus. And he comes up, and the Holy Spirit and the voice of God, you are my beloved Son, with you I am well pleased. And Luke says, okay, now did you see that? And did you hear that? That is the blessing and the promise that rests on all the children of Adam. All the sons of Adam are caught up in this blessing and this promise, which he then says, this is the story of our human ancestry that Jesus shares with us. And through him, we share the blessing of God.
So I kind of trying to match these up. Do they match up with only a few differences, or either the one goes back and one goes forward?
Well, if you want to take it home and sort it out, yeah, exactly. It is but you can look, and there's intentional reasons why some are included, some aren't included. But Matthew and Luke follow essentially the same pattern, but Luke has a different program in mind of why. Exactly, writing for different people. So,
what's important is and the godparents for sponsors for, but we also ask the community.
Exactly, that's right.
This is an example of the community that's represented by this title, and the baptism becomes the community.
That's right, and that we all share in this celebratory event. So next week we have Jesus growing up, and we will be in Luke chapter 2, verse 21. Jesus is 8 days old, down to the end of the chapter, verse 52, when they travel back to Nazareth. Oh, Luke chapter 2, verses 22 to 52. 22 to 52 in Luke chapter 2, and we will be looking at Jesus growing up and his belonging in a family, in a community, and in a culture. So, let's say our prayers. Gracious God, what a gift and a blessing it is to come together to share your word, to share our journey of faith, and to open our hearts and our minds and our lives that we might grow ever more fully into the children of God that you created us to be. What a blessing it is to be here. What a blessing it is that we are here together. Help us to celebrate the gift of life together and to bring praise and glory to your name. In Jesus' name we ask. Amen.